In this first realm, I have only two reservations. One reservation is, I guess I'd describe it as tactical. And the other does come from some free speech sensibility. Here's the tactical reservation. I happen to live in a world of college students and university students, and I am a dad in a family with 5 kids, from a 3rd grader to college-age students. And I've got to be careful that I'm not too self-righteous and that there's not too much of a generation gap in my engagement with young folks. And that I'm not too distanced from their vocabulary and their sense of context, that I'm just written off and don't get it. And so sometimes there will be expressions and symbols that strike me, who can still sing Buffalo Springfield, as an expression of hate speech and as politically incorrect. And I'll realize I only alienate my own children and they tune me out, in the same way that I complained when I sang those songs 30 years ago that the generation above me didn't understand me. And so for tactical reasons, I think sometimes one has to have some restraint and not be just too heavy-handed, particularly when dealing with college and high school and in my case, to some degree, professional students. Here's the second reservation I have. I do think we have to be careful about what we call hate speech. Rick gave us some graphic examples of terrible stuff. And my instinct is to largely focus on that. As you bring too many things into what you call hate speech, you risk crossing the following line. You risk condemning your own political opponents simply because they are clever and good at exaggeration or satire or a biting turn of phrase to attack your ideological position. And so you've got to be very careful, if you are a conservative, not to attack a liberal and claim that the liberal is engaged in hate speech merely because that liberal has come up with a brilliant image or turn of phrase in attacking your conservative position. And the same is true in reverse. You damage, in my view, the political discourse value that we have when you caricature too much. I'll give you a graphic example in my world of the university. Across the United States, many conservative students have attacked affirmative action policies at their universities through a very graphic and controversial form of protest known as affirmative action bake sales. There was one at the University of Richmond, for example, a few years ago. And the affirmative action bake sale involves putting up card tables on a campus green and selling brownies and cookies and baked goods and so on, and charging white students the market price and charging a penny to minority students. Now, it's very offensive to many minority students to pass by the affirmative action bake sale table. And often trustees and members of state legislators and university presidents and faculty members and fellow students will call for the bake sale students to be punished, to be kicked out of the university, to be ostracized because it violates the university's policies. I have difficulty personally with punishing the students for engaging in the bake sale. I don't care for the way they've decided to express themselves. It wouldn't be my way of engaging in debate over affirmative action. But it is exaggeration, it is satire, it is graphic use of symbols to make a legitimate intellectual point. Happens not to be my point, happens not to be my view of the use of of race-conscious and gender-conscious policies to diversify American universities. I happen to believe those are enlightened policies, but society is strongly divided on that point, and people are entitled to their viewpoint on such issues. And to label as hate speech the use of exaggeration to make that underlying intellectual point, I think actually diminishes our ability to engage them in real dialogue, because unlike the Holocaust denial folks, they can be engaged in real dialogue. And I think, for me, crosses a kind of First Amendment sensibility. So I would disagree with their position, but I wouldn't attempt to ban them or punish them for expressing it in that way. Let me move on to the second area that I described, the fulcrum of affiliation. My view here is that existing First Amendment doctrine and First Amendment values in fact gives us a fairly robust set of weapons to attack hate speech in this arena. So we do in our society, for example, in vast areas of membership, penalize in very severe ways hateful expression that we might not be able to penalize consistent with the First Amendment or First Amendment values in the general marketplace. I'll give you some very easy examples. In virtually all employment settings today, the rules that govern Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibit hostile working environments, effectively ban large swatches of hate speech. So, not far from where we are, there are people in beautiful office buildings working in banks and law firms and architectural firms and every form of human enterprise to restaurants and so on. And all of those employees, whatever they may be thinking about race and religion and other forms of identity, can lose their jobs if they cross certain lines, engaging in hate speech that's deemed to create a hostile working environment. We have a second vast area of American society in which membership is, American Express says membership has its privileges. Well, in these areas, membership has its obligations, and that's education. Students, teachers in public schools and in most private schools at the elementary and high school level are restrained in what they can say on school grounds to one another in the vocabulary of racial or religious hatred. And if they cross those bounds, they can be kicked out of school. There are many, many examples of this, and American First Amendment doctrine is sympathetic to these notions. American First Amendment doctrine says that when a person is involved in a captive audience situation, which is what the workplace often is, or what school often is, or when there are other societal values, such as the functions of carrying on the work in the workplace, or the educative function that we have for our children. I think some of Buffalo Springfield ultimately ended up in Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and they had the song, "Teach Your Children Well." Our voices aren't high enough to sing that as good. But we in our society have often said that because we generally, as a social norm, to use Susan's concept, want to encourage values of human respect and human dignity and community in our students, have the right in our public schools to condemn the kinds of virulent, hate-filled rhetoric and symbols that we might be forced to tolerate in the larger marketplace. Before I leave the second fulcrum of affiliation, I'll give you an interesting sort of brain teaser conundrum that a university might face. Universities are curious creatures when you deal with membership. Universities are, on the one hand, marketplaces, but I've also thought that they're also moral spaces. So although in some respect we think of the university as the ultimate marketplace of ideas, as the place where we, in science and the arts and law and medicine, want intellectual combat to be a no-holds-barred exploration and with the best idea wins, there are also, in my view, healthy academic traditions that demand certain elements of civility, rationality, mutuality of respect, listening, decorum, etc. So that universities do not have to tolerate disruptive speech in the classroom, for example. And they certainly don't have to tolerate the kinds of destructive speech that is often characteristic of hate speech.